Well, hello guys, I am Pixie and it is time for a new doll video. It is another doll from my fantasy theater and an original character inspired by medieval and early modern fashion. From my teenage years, I can say I grew into a big fan of fashion history, fantasy fashion and lore. So, if you also find these things interesting and worth your time, then you have come into the right channel. In this video, I want to fulfill my idea from 2020 and make an executioner's character doll. I know, maybe it is quite an uncanny idea for a doll to have, but you know, it is one of the things I'm fascinated by. Also, an interesting profession that we all know about, but also a profession we know almost nothing about. So, I want to create a doll inspired by one particular artist and art, which started this whole idea and poked my thoughts for a whole 6 years. And here you can see my own sketches of the upcoming doll. I assure you, there are a lot of those sneaky ideas rubbing around my brain folds. And I want to release them! Starting now. Now I have time, the appropriate skills and immense inspiration to create this doll. If you want to hear the history behind medieval executioners and watch me create a fantasy version of one as a doll, then welcome! Let's start with an art that launched it all. It is even a small comic created by Miyule Art in 2020. It was time I first saw this guy, and he irreversibly stirred something that had already been there in me. And I thought, damn, I want to make this doll and learn more about the profession. So, look at this guy. Florian, the executioner. I immediately fall for this silhouette, for the contrast of his character and profession, the unusually shaped sword, red and black colors, and the little story behind him just sent me in awe.
Would you like to work for me, young executioner?
A gloomy tall figure in a full-faced mask warmly invited Florian. Who are you? To be executioner asked guardedly, fearing that he already knew the answer. A crow-like figure watched sharply upside down on Florian's timid body, kneeling there on the cold wet cobblestone of the street. Just for a moment, amused by his sheer innocence.
Death.
So, this little interaction sat in my head for ages. I feel so relieved now sharing it with you. And kisses to my precious fiancé for voicing it for this video. Also, big shout out to Miyule Art for the great inspiration. Honestly, I have goosebumps for these 4 panels of the story. Especially knowing what I know now about the inception of the executioner at medieval times. The history of professional executioner is in many ways a record of refining the choreography of demise. It reflects a pursuit of precision, control, and more efficient ways to carry out and contain the spectacle of the execution. The professionalization of it, a deeply unsettling practice, was shaped over centuries by a marginalized group of men denied full civil status and excluded from everyday life. Forced to live on the edges of society, the executioner embodied a set of contradictions. A key figure in the ritual of public execution, an instrument of state power, and yet a morally ambiguous presence who was widely feared and despised. It is coincidence or not, but the Florian very much could be an executioner in his young age, because he was already born as one. And he had no choice but to grow into this profession, just as his father did, just as his grandfather before, and his great-grandfather even earlier. As you got it right, often it was inherited and destined to be an executioner if you were born into the family of one. And there was almost no way around it. It was a profession that was feared and required, since execution has been part of most legal systems across human history. For a large part of human history, death was regarded as an appropriate and acceptable response to crime, acts of betrayal, or what was seen as a moral failure. Yet, while society spent time debating who should be condemned to such a fate, far less thought was given to a quieter, more uncomfortable question. What did people actually think about the individual responsible for carrying out the sentence? Executioners held one of the most paradoxical positions throughout human history. They were a necessary part of maintaining systems of law, authority, and social order. Yet at the same time, they were often feared, kept out of sight, avoided, or deliberately pushed to the margins. In ancient Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written legal systems, including the Code of Hammurabi, established a wide range of punishments that included execution. Yet the historical records that survive from this period rarely speak about the individuals who actually carried out these sentences. In many cases, executioners were slaves or low-ranking soldiers, intentionally left unnamed and largely absent from documentation. This absence does not appear to be accidental. By leaving executioners out of the written record, responsibility for execution remained firmly with rulers and judges, rather than with the individuals who physically performed the act. In this way, invisibility became its own form of stigma. Executioners were relied upon, yet denied recognition, identity, and a place in history. Ancient Rome approached the matter differently. Executions were public, highly theatrical, and often deliberately brutal. Amphitheaters, crucifixions, and staged spectacles of punishment attracted large crowds and turned execution into a form of public display. And yet, even in this setting, those responsible for carrying out the executions were still diminished in status. Slaves were tasked with releasing wild animals or delivering the final blows to the condemned. Gladiators could rise to fame and recognition, but executioners themselves remained largely anonymous. Rome made demise visible, yet kept the executioner at a careful moral distance. Not all societies viewed executioners as outsiders. In early medieval Scandinavia, before the spread of Christianity, executions were closely connected to ideas of honor and kinship. Punishment was often carried out by families or local communities, rather than by designated professionals. The individual delivering the fatal blow was not treated as a social outcast, but rather seen as a representative of communal justice or of wronged kin. As Christianity expanded and legal system became more centralized, professional executioners began to appear, and with them came increasing stigma. What had once been understood as an act tied to honor gradually transformed into an occupation associated with disgrace. This shift highlights something significant. The stigma was often linked to bureaucratization rather than to the violence itself. A similar pattern can be observed in pre-colonial indigenous Australia. Within payback systems, sentences were carried out by kin groups or selected warriors. These acts were embedded within broader spiritual and social frameworks, rather than assigned to isolated individuals. There was no distinct executioner class and no inherited sense of shame. Justice remained relational rather than detached. In some cultures, execution was not seen as punishment at all, it was understood as a sacred duty. In the Aztec Empire, acts of sacrifice and execution were believed to be essential for maintaining cosmic balance. Priests and warriors performed these deeds as offerings to the gods, seen as necessary to sustain the universe itself. Executioners in this context were visible, respected, and powerful figures, though they were also feared because of their close association with both blood and the divine. A similar connection between execution, authority, and ritual could be found in the Ashanti Empire of West Africa. Their executioners served as agents of king and could be honored warriors or highly trusted officials. While their role carried a certain spiritual risk, it did not bring disgrace. In societies where kingship held sacred meaning, executioners could be elevated in status rather than pushed to the margins. Europe developed some of the most extreme and deeply entrenched forms of stigma surrounding executioners. In medieval England, executioners were often drawn from the ranks of criminals and forced into the role. They lived on the outskirts of towns, excluded from taverns, guilds, and everyday social life, effectively becoming untouchable within their communities. Their payment could even come in the form of condemned person's clothing, a grim symbol that carried both reward and a sense of contamination. During the Renaissance, parts of Italy and France took this even further by establishing hereditary executioner families. Well-known dynasties, such as the Sansons, became infamous, with children inheriting the role and its social consequences regardless of their own wishes. Marriages between executioner families helped reinforce a rigid caste-like system that was nearly impossible to leave behind. Prussia offers a particularly striking contradiction. Executioners were granted exclusive rights to certain trades, such as dealing in hides, which could provide them with a stable and sometimes substantial income. Yet despite this financial security, the social stigma surrounding them remained unchanged. They could achieve a degree of wealth and still be widely feared and despised. In Japan, during the Tokugawa era, the stigma was formalized in one of the most rigid ways. Executioners were placed within the Eta caste, later known as burakumin, a group permanently excluded from mainstream society. Their association with death and impurity marked them as fundamentally separate, denying them full social acceptance. A legacy of discrimination that continued long after the system itself was officially abolished. Authoritarian systems often erased executioners in their own distant ways. In the Ottoman Empire, executioners were part of the palace structure, often serving as slaves who carried out sentences in private. Their anonymity strengthened the image and mystique of absolute power. Even after they were gone, they remained invisible, buried in an unmarked grave with no recognition. In Puritan New England, executioners occupied a deeply paradoxical position. They were seen as instruments of divine justice, yet at the same time stood as symbols of sin and moral burden. Across cultures and centuries, executioners have been mirrors of societal values. Where death was sacred, executioners were priests. Where justice was communal, they were kin. Where punishment was theater, they were performers. Where the law was bureaucratic, they were erased. Executioners were necessary and yet deeply uncomfortable. For this particular character, I picked the fashion style of England and Europe from the 14th to 17th centuries. So I wanted to learn about executioners from this time frame and area more closely. As I mentioned before, becoming an executioner was not typically a matter of personal choice. More often it was something one was born into. Although the role was not formally hereditary by law, it was widely treated as a family occupation. The position of executioner was commonly passed from father to eldest son, while younger sons and nephews stayed within the profession, filling roles in other cities or assisting where needed. Daughters of executioners almost always married the sons of other executioners, thereby ensuring continuous lineage of those who would carry out the profession. The presence of executioners and their families in everyday society was so feared that their lives were tightly controlled. Early modern cities imposed regulations governing nearly every aspect of their existence. From where they could live to which places they were allowed to enter, and even whom they were permitted to touch. Because everyone in medieval communities knew who the executioners were, they were often shunned. Carrying out executions was seen as necessary, but it didn't earn them respect. They were excluded from everyday life, and many were forced to live on the outskirts of towns. When that wasn't possible, they were pushed into undesirable areas and treated as unclean by the public. Executioners were often denied basic rights, including citizenship, and banned from places like churches and bathhouses. In some regions, strict rules even dictated where they could live and what they were allowed to do. In Scandinavia, executioners were sometimes marked by having one or both ears cut off, making them instantly recognizable. In other regions, they were branded with hot irons on the head, permanently tying them to their role, quite literally marking their profession on their faces. In much of Europe, executioners were forbidden from living within the towns they served. Apart from required church attendance, where they and their families were confined to a designated pew, they entered the city mainly to perform their duties. This included not only the torture or execution of the condemned, but also a range of tasks that came with unusual privileges. Among them were the exclusive rights to clean cesspools and keep any valuables found, claim stray animals, and take ownership of animal carcasses and their valuable hides. These tasks also placed executioners in a position of authority over other social outcasts like lepers and courtesans, from whom they could collect fees, giving them a strange kind of power at the margins of society. While the grim work of scavenging could add to an executioner's income, it was the right to dip into that could make them relatively wealthy. This privilege allowed them to take portions of goods and produce from market vendors and carts entering the city. It was meant to offset their social isolation with material comfort, but often deepened resentment, as many believed executioners took lives as casually as they collected harvest. The fact that this right resembled a tax, one otherwise reserved for kings, only reinforced that perception. Executioners were not as often assumed crude or uneducated figures who relished violence. Many were literate and practically educated, much like other tradesmen. Because they were usually barred from formal schooling, their training took place within the family. Charles Henry Sanson, for example, was expelled from school once his background was discovered. Their education focused on local laws, judicial procedures, and the rituals that defined their role. Most importantly, executioners were rigorously trained in human anatomy. Their expertise was so well known that they were sometimes called upon in place of physicians. A 1908 British Medical Journal entry notes that in 1578 Frederick II granted Copenhagen's executioners Andreas Freimut a license to set bones and treat old wounds, though not recent ones. It also records that in 1695 another executioner, Andreas Liebknecht, gained such a reputation for treating venereal disease that he wrote a book on it. In 16th century Germany, in the town of Hof, lived a man named Franz Schmidt. Known as Meister Franz, he is one of the few executioners of his time to have kept a detailed diary throughout his 45-year career, documenting executions, punishments, and his role in enforcing the law. He married chief executioner's daughter Maria and eventually became chief executioner after his father-in-law. He fathered 7 children, and his salary, on par with the city's wealthiest jurists, allowed him to have a spacious residence in Nuremberg. After his retirement in 1617, he began a new lucrative career as medical consultant. One common misconception about the medieval period is the scale of executions. While capital punishment was indeed a key part of the justice system, it wasn't carried out as frequently as many assume. Even after decades of service, some executioners recorded only a few hundred executions, meaning they often had to rely on other forms of work to support themselves. In Schmidt's diary, he detailed all punishments that he performed. During his entire career, he flogged at least 367 offenders, usually before effecting the court's order for their banishment from the city. Many more were whipped by his assistant. Despite all his fruitful work, he seemed to have been a fairly respected man. Even so, he could retire from his profession as hangman and instead end his life as a surprisingly enough healer, claiming to have treated more than 15,000 patients at the end of his life. Yet this anatomical knowledge of executioners had one single aim: efficiency. Executioners were judged by their precision in carrying out sentences without turning them into gruesome spectacles. Public executions by sword, fire, or wheel were staged displays of royal authority. Justice had to appear smooth and almost natural. Any disruption could be seen by the crowd as divine intervention, challenging the legitimacy of the crown. A botched execution, therefore, was not just a failure of skill, but an affront to justice itself. Despite their social status, many medieval executioners carried out their duties with a high degree of professionalism, discipline, and efficiency, qualities that in hindsight might even be seen as admirable. However, their careful approach was driven by more than a desire to minimize suffering. The job itself was dangerous, and executioners risked their own lives each time they performed an execution. If they made a mistake, caused unnecessary suffering, or appeared incompetent, they could face the anger of the crowd. A botched execution could be life-threatening for the executioner. In some German towns, Joel F. Harrington notes in The Faithful Executioner, an executioner was granted 3 strikes, after which the crowd might seize and switch him with the condemned person's place. If an executioner required more than 3 strikes of a sword to complete a deed, they might be subjected to the same fate themselves. Though rarely codified, cities were intolerant of failure. To avoid turning into victims themselves, executioners thought the fastest, most reliable methods. Nevertheless, grievous mishaps and executions happened. For example, in 17th century France, execution by sword was a privilege reserved for the nobility. Commoners got the rope, nobles got the blade. However, Henry, Count of Chalais, had the misfortune of being sentenced to death for conspiring against Cardinal Richelieu at a very inconvenient time. The professional executioner was unavailable, and the local authorities were in a bind. Their brilliant solution? They offered a full pardon to a sentenced prisoner if he would agree to act as an executioner. The prisoner, who had absolutely zero training in the delicate art of execution, was given a heavy sword. What followed was less of a clean cut and more of carpentry project. The amateur swung and missed entirely, hitting the count in the shoulder. panic set for both the crowd and the so-called executioner. Unfortunately, the Count remained conscious through the first several hits. It took 29 blows to finalize the sentence. By the end, the sword had become so notched and dull that the prisoner reportedly had to finish the job using the sword more like a saw. Jesus. The crowd, who were used to the theatricality of such events, were so horrified that a riot nearly broke out. Another notorious one is the execution of the Duke of Monmouth, 1685. It deserves a shout-out for the wildest dialogue. He paid his executioner Jack Ketch several gold guineas to do it well. And you know where it's going, right? After Ketch failed to execute him on the first, second, and third swings, Monmouth actually stood up from the block and looked at him. It took 5 swings and a butcher's knife to finish the job. The crowd was so enraged by Ketch's incompetence that the guards had to escort him away so he wouldn't be torn apart by the crowd. Media often portrays medieval executioners as masked figures in black robes, hiding their identities. A common stereotype portrays the executioner as a shadowy hooded figure with his face hidden behind the mask. Most couldn't stay anonymous at all. The medieval executioner was typically fully dressed and rarely hooded. He didn't usually wear black either. In fact, many depictions show him in a quite colorful clothing. Their identities were rarely concealed unless there was a specific reason, such as concern for their safety or social standing. In most cases, they were well known within their communities. The image of the hooded executioner is therefore less a historical fact and more a creation of later myth and popular imagination. Executioners were by no means wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They earned a steady income, with certain execution bringing extra pay, while travel, lodging and meals were often covered. A hard-working and ambitious hangman could accumulate a respectable amount of money over time. A privilege the executioner had at the time was that he got to keep the garment of the sentenced, as long as the criminal was considered without honor or a stranger to the community. And as most sentenced to execution were considered without honor, the executioner pretty much kept all the clothing he desired. This meant that the executioner in many cases could be quite well dressed to common folk's annoyance. However, their ability to dress well was not always appreciated. A disgruntled 1603 account complained that a German executioner dressed so finely that even nobility might envy his shoes, and that his mother wore garments as grand as princes. In Sweden, the executioner Clement Foss was described in 1594 as wearing flashy clothing, likely funded by his earnings and items taken from those he executed. In some cases, authorities tried to limit this. When the wealthy Augsburg's guildmaster Ulrich Schwarz was executed in 1478, the city council forbade the executioner from taking his clothes so as not to preserve his memory. There are also claims that executioners were sometimes required to dress in distinctive ways. According to historical sources, they were occasionally made to wear striped or unusually cut clothing. It is uncertain whether the oddly styled clothing seen in biblical scenes truly reflects how executioners dressed. More likely, these outfits were meant to appear exotic. Some sources also suggest that executioners often wore red, but this claim should be treated with caution. Modern interpretations of color can be misleading. While red is sometimes linked to sin and immorality, its meaning varied depending on who wore it. For example, if a scholar wore red, it reflected his status as a scholarly distinction at the time. When it comes to colors, red has a long history as one of the most valued and powerful colors. It was one of the most important colors in the Middle Ages. Its vivid tone made it a symbol of status, authority, and identity, while also being linked to energy and emotion. Red also symbolized courage and power. Because red dyes were rare and difficult to produce, red textiles were expensive and highly priced. Brightness mattered more than shade, and rich tones like scarlet and crimson were especially valued. White was considered the color of innocence. It was associated with light and divine wisdom and played an important role in Christian symbolism. Undergarments were often in lighter natural colors. White was popular as it symbolized purity. Black color evolved from a symbol of death and humility into a fashionable, expensive color representing power, dignity, and high status. While initially representing penitence for clergy, by the 14th century, high-quality black dyes enabled entire figures, merchants, and nobility to wear it as a mark of sophistication, modesty, and wealth. For my executioner doll, I picked a red, black, white, and brown color palette with golden accents. I found it curious that executioners wore things that belonged to the convicted people. It means that, obviously, nobility was also judged. So I chose to create a richer exemplar of the executioner, maybe even a bit stereotypical. I picked some things from illustrations, some things from medieval fashion, and kept the idea of a more noble, if you wish, looking guy. A young man with an open identity, with a tired, perceptive gaze, who was destined to this profession and takes not much joy in doing it, but the one who has to. He possesses the materialistic benefits of his craft, but is fated to be a tool of justice himself, with no options but this. Another noticeable detail of this profession that I want to add to my character is that heavy sword I mentioned. It is not just a regular heavy sword, but dedicated to one specific task that you have already guessed: execution. An executioner's sword. Unlike the ceremonial sword used to announce a judgment, the executioner's sword served as a particular tool of justice. Though it shared the name and the shape of a weapon, it was not considered one in the traditional sense, but rather an instrument designed specifically for carrying out executions. It was used for decapitation, ideally in a single, precise strike, while the condemned person knelt or sat. Compared to other forms of capital punishment, this method was often seen as more honorable and did not carry the same stigma for the individual or the family. Over time, the sword itself became a powerful symbol of justice. Functionality was essential to its design. Most surviving executioner's swords resemble late Gothic battle swords, typically measuring around 1 meter in length. However, they differ in key ways. The blades are wide, thin, flexible, with blunt or rounded tips since they were meant only for cutting, not thrusting. Their added width also allowed for repeated sharpening. They were designed for two-handed use. Executioner's swords were slightly heavier than typical battle swords, weighing around 1–2 kilograms, and were balanced differently, with the center of gravity positioned closer to the tip to improve cutting efficiency. Because of this design, executioner's swords delivered greater force toward the tip, making them well suited for cutting. Some surviving swords have 2 to 4 small holes near the tip, often called bloody holes, though their purpose is still uncertain. The idea that they helped blood flow away or kept it from splashing the audience is likely a later myth. Other explanations commonly mentioned in museums include symbolic meanings, like reference to the Holy Trinity, or practical uses such as attaching weights or preventing the sword from being reused in battle, though none are clearly proven. More speculative theories suggest people believed weapon could trap fragments of victims' soul, and these holes allowed them to escape, protecting the executioner. Another idea is that they discouraged reshaping the blade into a sharp-tipped weapon. While evidence is lacking, the notion of preventing a tool of justice from becoming a battle weapon does fit the mindset of the time. Often those swords had an engraved writing on them. A good example is a sword once owned by Karl Huss, the last executioner of Cheb. Its blade bears the inscription, "When I raise this sword, may God grant the sinner eternal life." Another pronounced quotes, "I spare nobody. I wish the sinner eternal life as gift. I live, I know not how long. I die, but I know not when. I move without knowing whither. I wander, I am so tranquil." He who ambitiously exalts himself and thinks only of evil has his neck already encompassed by punishment. Such decoration often reflected a town's desire for prestige, commissioning high-quality pieces from leading workshops. In some cases, executioners' swords were also created as masterworks by guild members and then gifted to the city. These swords could be acquired in several ways: ordered and paid for by the city, funded by the condemned, especially wealthier individuals seeking dignity, presented as a craftsman's masterpiece, or donated by patrons. If no dedicated swords was available, a standard battle sword might be used instead. Many cities owned multiple executioners' swords. And some executioners needed multiple swords for large executions, when dozens of criminals could be executed in a single event. Some swords may have been collected rather than actively used, reflecting interest in preserving such artifacts. Although sword executions had been practiced in Europe for centuries, most surviving specialized executioners' swords date from the early 16th to the mid-18th century. Despite this, their design closely resembles late medieval battle swords. These purpose-built swords emerged in early 1500s as the executioner's role became more professionalized and their form remained largely unchanged afterward. This particular executioner character has no name behind him, only a profession and the idea that I breathed into his blank doll body. And now, when he's almost completed, I offer you to become his owner. I will put a link in the description where you can buy him for your collection. If you are already an owner, I thank thee most kindly for granting this humble hand-wrought fella a new dwelling. Thy patronage and favor toward such craft gladden mine heart. May it bring a measure of olden spirit into thy keeping. To you, my viewers, many thanks for watching this video and staying here with me today. Hope you discovered something new and interesting from the past of our history, and learned something about doll making. Also, boundless gratitude to my patrons who support me financially. I can't express enough meaning of such a generous gesture to me. And I invite you to join my Patreon and become a member of this channel if you want to support me with a shiny coin and keep watching my videos. Write comments, I love reading them, and like this video if you want more people to be introduced to my channel. So now you have it. The Executioner, bringer of justice. I loved creating him. I love his facial expression, his fashion, his mighty sword, and the history behind his occupation. And I hope you do too. Subscribe for more. See you in my next videos, guys. Bye! By leaving executioners out of the written record, responsibility for execution remained firmly with rulers and judges, rather than with the individuals who physically performed the fact. In societies where kingship held sacred meaning, executioners could be elevated in status rather than passed. It took 29 blows to finalize this sentence. I can't imagine what noodle arms this prisoner could have to make 29 blows. 29! Or practical uses such as attaching weights or preventing the sword from being reused in battle. Though none are clear. I'm tired, boss. It's 4 hours of voiceover, and it is not even done yet.